Have you ever wondered what life was truly like for women almost 1,000 years ago, in the year 1050? Could you imagine a world where your very own body, a natural and vital part of being a woman, was seen as a source of profound mystery, fear, and even danger? A time when a woman's monthly cycle didn't just bring discomfort, but also a crushing weight of ancient beliefs and strict rules that governed nearly every aspect of her existence. Let's delve into the chilling realities of medieval womanhood and explore the deeply ingrained taboos that shaped their lives. Number 10, the taboo of touching food and drink. Imagine a world where your natural bodily processes could be believed to literally spoil the food that kept your family alive or curdle the milk intended for your children. 1050, a woman experiencing her monthly flow faced a deeply ingrained societal taboo against touching or preparing food and drink. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It was a widespread, deeply held belief rooted in centuries of tradition and superstition, often reinforced by religious teachings of the time. The very essence of her touch was thought to carry an inherent taint, an invisible impurity that could render sustenance unfit for consumption. Consider the daily life of a medieval household. Preparation of meals was a central, continuous activity, especially for women. From grinding grains to kneading dough for bread, from churning butter to stewing vegetables and meats over an open fire, these tasks were vital for survival. Now picture a woman, perhaps the lady of the manor or a peasant wife, waking with the telltale signs of her monthly flow. Immediately, a silent alarm would sound in her mind. She would know that her customary duties in the kitchen, duties she performed with practiced ease and responsibility, were suddenly off limits. The warmth of the hearth, the comforting scent of baking bread, the camaraderie of preparing a communal meal, all these familiar aspects of her day would become distant and forbidden. The fear surrounding this taboo was potent. People genuinely believed that a woman's touch during this time could cause bread to not rise, ale to sour in the barrel, milk to curdle instantly, or meat to spoil prematurely. It wasn't just about minor inconveniences. It was about the very real threat of food shortage and illness in a time when preservation methods were rudimentary and hygiene was poorly understood. A spoiled batch of ale could mean lost income for a brewing household, or a lack of comforting drink for tired laborers. A ruined pot of stew could mean a hungry family. These were not abstract fears. They were tangible anxieties rooted in the harsh realities of medieval life. Historical accounts, though sparse and often biased, sometimes hint at these practices. Scholars examining household inventories and monastic rules from the period occasionally find subtle clues about women's roles being restricted during certain times, often interpreted as related to menstruation. While specific citations from 1050 are rare in the modern sense, the pervasive nature of these beliefs can be pieced together from later medieval texts, folklore, and the enduring customs that stretched across centuries. For instance, some medieval medical texts, while misinformed by modern standards, perpetuated the idea that menstrual blood was a potent, even poisonous, substance capable of harming plants, animals, and most certainly food. This medical misunderstanding lent a pseudo-scientific veneer to the taboo, making it seem less like superstition and more like a protective measure. So what happened when a woman was unable to avoid food preparation, perhaps in a small, isolated household where she was the only adult woman? The burden of guilt and anxiety would have been immense. She might try to be extra careful, to touch as little as possible, or to wash her hands incessantly, even if she believed the impurity was deeper than what soap and water could remove. The social pressure was also a powerful deterrent. Food spoiled, even for unrelated reasons, the woman experiencing her period might be blamed, facing the scorn or suspicion of her family and community. This potential for blame fostered a deep sense of self-policing, ensuring that the taboo was often observed even without direct supervision. The act of eating itself could also become complicated. While she might not be barred from consuming food, the idea of sitting at a communal table, sharing dishes that others had prepared, or knowing that her very presence might be perceived as a subtle threat to the purity of the meal could create an isolating experience. She might be expected to eat separately, or to simply take her portion and retreat, reinforcing her temporary status as an outsider within her own home. Fear of contamination wasn't just about touching. It was about the perceived aura of impurity that surrounded her during this time. This deeply rooted belief system permeated the very air a woman breathed, making even the simple act of preparing and consuming a meal an arduous journey through a landscape of societal restrictions and personal apprehension. Number 9. The taboo of entering sacred spaces. In the year 1050, religion permeated every fiber of daily life. For women, this meant that their monthly cycle carried profound spiritual implications, particularly the deeply ingrained taboo against entering sacred spaces like churches, chapels, and even designated holy ground. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a significant spiritual and social exclusion, effectively cutting women off from the very heart of their community's religious life during a time when spiritual solace and participation were considered essential for salvation and well-being. Belief was straightforward. A woman experiencing her period was considered ritually unclean, her body undergoing a natural process that was nonetheless deemed polluting in the eyes of the divine. This concept of ritual impurity had deep roots in ancient traditions, often finding parallels in Old Testament laws, which, though not directly applicable to medieval Christian practice in all their strictness, nonetheless influenced theological thought and popular understanding of cleanliness and sanctity. For many in 1050, this impurity was not a moral failing, but a physical state that made one unsuitable for direct engagement with the divine presence, particularly within consecrated buildings. Imagine Sunday Mass, the central gathering point for any medieval community. The ringing of the church bells would call everyone to worship, drawing families from their homes and fields. For a woman in her monthly flow, those bells would serve as a reminder of her exclusion. She would stand outside, perhaps listening to the distant chanting, or remain at home, feeling the heavy weight of her inability to participate. This wasn't just about missing a sermon, it was about being denied communion, a central sacrament in the Christian faith, which was believed to be vital for spiritual nourishment and forgiveness of sins. To be cut off from communion, especially in a time of deep faith and fear of eternal damnation, was a truly terrifying prospect. Beyond the weekly Mass, there were other important religious rites: baptisms, funerals, marriages, and daily prayers. A woman's exclusion meant she could not fully participate in these communal milestones if they happened to coincide with her period. Imagine the sorrow of being unable to stand fully present within the church for the baptism of a new child, or to properly mourn a loved one at their funeral service inside the hallowed walls. The emotional and spiritual toll of such exclusion would have been immense, fostering a sense of isolation and perhaps even shame, despite the naturalness of her bodily function. Scholars studying medieval canon, law, and theological texts from the period frequently encounter discussions about ritual purity and the circumstances under which individuals might be barred from sacred spaces. While specific church edicts from exactly 1050 might be elusive in modern consolidated form, the general consensus across the High Middle Ages clearly reflects this widespread prohibition. Bishops and priests were tasked with enforcing these rules, and communities largely accepted them as divine mandate. Perceived sanctity of the church building itself, often seen as a direct extension of God's dwelling on earth, demanded an absolute state of purity from those who entered. Any perceived taint from a menstruating woman was believed to desecrate this holy space, potentially drawing divine displeasure upon the entire community. This taboo also extended beyond just churches to other sacred or highly respected areas. Pilgrim routes, holy wells, or even certain spots within a manor that held religious significance could be considered off-limits. The landscape of daily life was subtly but powerfully shaped by these spiritual boundaries. The woman was not just impure herself. Her very presence, it was believed, could impart impurity to the space around her, disrupting its sacred essence. For women living under this stricture, the experience was profoundly impactful. It reinforced the idea that their bodies, at certain times, were inherently problematic or even dangerous from a spiritual perspective. This created a tension between their natural biological reality and their fervent desire for spiritual connection and community participation. They might offer prayers from outside the church doors or seek spiritual guidance from a priest in a less sacred setting, but the core communal and sacramental experience was denied. This forced separation deepened their understanding of their place within the spiritual hierarchy of the time, emphasizing a perceived vulnerability and a constant need to manage their bodily functions in accordance with deeply held religious and societal norms. Number 8, the taboo against bathing or washing hair. While today we associate cleanliness with good health, in 1050, a deeply unsettling taboo often dictated that women should avoid bathing or washing their hair during menstruation. This wasn't because they lacked understanding of hygiene. Rather, it was rooted in complex, often contradictory beliefs about the nature of the impurity itself and the perceived effects of water. For many, the idea was that menstrual blood was not merely a physical discharge, but a potent, internal force or essence that could be disturbed by water, or that water itself could become polluted by contact with the menstruating body. Imagine the discomfort. Medieval life was already not known for its widespread daily bathing. Water had to be fetched, heated, and bodies were typically washed infrequently, often in shared tubs or public bathhouses. However, during menstruation, the natural desire for cleanliness would be heightened, yet it was often denied. The lingering feeling of stickiness, the faint smells that would inevitably arise, and the general sense of being unclean would have been magnified by the inability to wash thoroughly. This created a cycle of physical discomfort, compounded by societal expectations that prohibited relief. One strand of belief held that contact with water during this period could somehow spread the impurity, not merely wash it away. The water, it was thought, could become tainted, and then potentially spread that taint to others, or even back to the woman herself in a more harmful way. This aligns with the broader medieval understanding of miasma, the idea that disease and impurity could travel through the air or through substances like water. Another, perhaps more abstract, belief was that washing might somehow interfere with the natural process of purging the body of its harmful humors. Medieval medicine, based on the theory of four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, viewed menstruation as a necessary purification, a release of excess humors. Intervening with water, it was thought, could disrupt this vital cleansing process, potentially leading to illness or internal imbalance. Consider the practical implications. Hair, especially long hair common among women of the era, could become greasy and matted. Body odor would increase. This would contribute to the overall sense of being marked or different during her period, further reinforcing her perceived separation from the general population. It also meant that the physical discomfort of menstruation was not alleviated, but intensified, making the experience even more arduous and isolating. The very act of living in one's own skin became a source of significant tribulation. While there aren't many direct citations from 1050 detailing bathing practices during menstruation, the general historical understanding of medieval hygiene, combined with later medieval medical and folkloric texts, supports the prevalence of such taboos. For example, some early medical treatises, though often speculative by modern standards, discuss the dangers of bathing during various bodily states, including menstruation, often linking it to vulnerability to illness or the concept of upsetting the body's natural balance. Folk beliefs passed down through generations often codified these practices, making them deeply ingrained in the subconscious of the community. The effect of this taboo was multifaceted. On a personal level, it led to heightened physical discomfort and a feeling of perpetual uncleanliness. It reinforced the idea that the menstruating body was something to be managed, contained, and avoided, even by the woman herself. Socially, it subtly emphasized her temporary exclusion. While not as overtly visible as being barred from a church, the subtle signs of a lack of personal hygiene would have contributed to the perception of her unclean state, making others perhaps subconsciously keep their distance. It was a constant, intimate reminder of her temporary difference, a silent, internal struggle for cleanliness and comfort against the backdrop of prevailing superstition and limited understanding of the body's functions. This refusal to wash further intensified the perceived otherness of a woman during her monthly flow, reinforcing the idea that she was fundamentally altered, even compromised during this time, and that water, instead of purifying, could exacerbate her perceived impurity. Number 7, the taboo of engaging in sexual intercourse. One of the most profound and universally recognized taboos surrounding menstruation in 1050 was the strict prohibition against engaging in sexual intercourse. This wasn't merely a matter of personal preference or discomfort. It was a deeply ingrained societal and religious injunction, fueled by a complex web of beliefs about spiritual impurity, physical harm, and the potential for creating tainted or deformed offspring. For medieval men and women, particularly those within Christian communities, this taboo held immense weight, shaping intimate relationships and expectations within marriage. Primary rationale behind this prohibition stemmed from the pervasive belief that menstrual blood rendered a woman, and by extension, anything she touched or participated in, ritually unclean. This idea was deeply rooted in ancient texts and interpretations, including passages from the Old Testament that spoke of ritual impurity associated with bodily discharges. While the medieval church adapted and reinterpreted many of these laws, the concept of a woman being unclean during her period persisted strongly. Sexual union, being an intimate and powerful act, was deemed particularly susceptible to this perceived impurity. Engaging in intercourse during this time was considered a sin, a transgression against divine order and purity. Imagine a newly married couple in 1050. Their union was not just a personal bond, but a sacred covenant, often with the express purpose of procreation. However, the rhythm of their intimacy would be dictated not just by desire, but by the wife's monthly cycle. During her period, the marital bed would become a place of abstinence, a silent agreement to adhere to societal and religious dictates. This enforced separation, though temporary, would have had an impact on the emotional and physical aspects of their relationship, requiring understanding and adherence from both partners. Beyond the religious aspect, there were widespread folk beliefs about the physical dangers of coitus during menstruation. It was commonly believed that intercourse during this time could lead to the conception of children who were deformed, sickly, or afflicted with various ailments, such as leprosy or epilepsy. These beliefs, though entirely unfounded by modern medical understanding, were terrifyingly real for people in the Middle Ages, who often attributed unexplained illnesses and deformities to supernatural or impure causes. Stories and warnings about such tragic outcomes would have been passed down through generations, reinforcing the taboo with a sense of dread and protective caution. A man, fearful for the health and well-being of his future children, would naturally avoid intercourse with his menstruating wife. Medieval penitential books and theological texts from the High Middle Ages frequently list engaging in intercourse during menstruation as a sin, detailing the penances required for such transgressions. These texts served as guides for confessors and reinforced the moral gravity of the act within the Church's framework. The very act was deemed to pollute the participants, making them unfit for receiving communion or other sacraments until a period of purification, often involving prayer and abstinence, had passed. The spiritual consequences were as daunting as the perceived physical ones. This taboo created a specific rhythm within medieval marriages, influencing expectations and behavior. It meant that for roughly a quarter of her fertile life, a woman was considered unavailable for marital intimacy. This was not just about the woman's perceived impurity, but also about the man's responsibility to avoid sin and protect the potential sanctity of conception. Pressure to adhere to this taboo came from all sides: religious teachings, community expectations, and the deeply ingrained fear of negative consequences. For women, this meant a constant awareness of their body cycles, not just for personal comfort, but for marital and spiritual compliance. It reinforced the idea that their bodies were subject to forces and rules beyond their control, and that even the most intimate aspects of their lives were governed by ancient beliefs about purity and danger. The period of abstinence was a quiet acknowledgement of these rules, a testament to the pervasive power of taboos in shaping the private and spiritual lives of individuals in 1050. The weight of potential deformity in offspring, coupled with the threat of spiritual damnation, ensured that this particular taboo was observed with unwavering adherence, shaping the very fabric of marital intimacy. Number 6, the taboo of touching animals or crops. In an agrarian society like that of 1050, where survival was intimately tied to the health of livestock and the success of harvests, a profoundly impactful taboo dictated that a menstruating woman should avoid touching animals or crops. This belief was rooted in an ancient fear that the impurity of her monthly flow could sicken livestock, render fields barren, or even spoil harvested produce. It was a direct reflection of the period's deep dependence on the natural world and the pervasive belief that unseen forces and inherent properties governed its productivity. Imagine a peasant woman in the spring of 1050. Her days are filled with tending to the small garden plot that feeds her family, milking the cow, or caring for the chickens. Suddenly, her period begins. The routine tasks that form the backbone of her family's subsistence are now fraught with anxiety. She might be expected to step back from the milking pail, to refrain from gathering eggs, or to avoid walking through the nascent fields of wheat. The very touch of her hand, it was believed, could transmit a harmful essence, a mysterious blight that could wither plants or weaken animals. This belief was deeply interconnected with the medieval understanding of fertility and vitality. Menstruation, while a natural part of a woman's reproductive cycle, was often viewed through a lens of potential threat to the fertility of land and beasts. Blood, seen as a powerful, sometimes volatile substance, was thought to carry an inherent anti-fertility or corrupting influence when outside the body in this specific context. If a woman were to touch a pregnant cow, for instance, fear would spread that the calf might be stillborn or sickly. If she were to walk through a field, it was feared that the crops might fail to yield or become diseased. Historical accounts, though not often detailing specific menstrual restrictions in farming records, frequently mention the use of various rituals and superstitions to ensure agricultural success and animal health. The absence of specific warnings against menstruating women in official agricultural treatises does not mean the taboo was absent. Rather, it was likely so deeply ingrained in common folklore and daily practice that it was rarely written down as a formal prohibition. Anthropological studies of traditional societies and later medieval folk practices consistently reveal widespread beliefs about menstruation's impact on agricultural output and animal well-being, suggesting a continuous lineage of such fears. The economic implications of this taboo were significant. In a time when a bad harvest could mean starvation and sick animals could mean ruin, people were highly attuned to anything that might jeopardize their livelihoods. Perceived risk, however irrational from a modern perspective, was enough to enforce strict adherence. A woman might be encouraged, or even compelled, to withdraw from all agricultural tasks during her period, placing an additional burden on other family members. This could be particularly challenging for single women, widows, or households with limited labor. Consider the psychological burden on the woman. She was not only experiencing physical discomfort, but also the heavy weight of potentially harming her family's very means of survival. The sight of a struggling animal, a wilting plant, or a meager harvest could trigger immense guilt, even if she had nothing to do with it. This constant undercurrent of apprehension would color her daily interactions with the natural world, making her feel like a potential source of misfortune rather than a vital contributor to her household's prosperity. This taboo reinforced the idea that a woman's body, even in its natural state, possessed a mysterious and potent power that could be both creative and destructive, depending on the context. During menstruation, it was seen as potentially destructive to the very life forces that sustained medieval society. This belief system created a carefully managed separation between the menstruating woman and the vulnerable, life-giving aspects of her environment, ensuring that the critical resources of the community were, in their view, protected from any perceived contamination or harm. The invisible threat she posed to fields and flocks shaped her movements and duties, making her a silent guardian of the community's sustenance, even as she felt her own natural processes made her a danger. Number 5, the taboo of looking at a mirror or reflection. Among the more curious and deeply symbolic taboos surrounding menstruation in 1050 was the belief that a woman should avoid looking at her own reflection in a mirror, still water, or any reflective surface. This was not merely a matter of vanity. It was rooted in complex, often mystical, notions about the nature of the soul, the power of reflections, and the perceived taint or vulnerability of a menstruating woman's state. Taboo suggested that her reflection could either become tainted itself, or that seeing her own unclean image could invite misfortune or even cause harm to her well-being. In the medieval world, mirrors were not the common, mass-produced items they are today. They were often small, polished pieces of metal or glass, sometimes backed with lead, and were considered valuable, even magical objects. Reflections themselves were seen as powerful, capable of capturing or revealing aspects of the soul or the true nature of a person. It was believed that a reflection was more than just an image. It was a connection to the self, a subtle spiritual double. Given this understanding, a menstruating woman's reflection was thought to be particularly susceptible to negative influences, or to reflect her temporary state of ritual impurity in a tangible, dangerous way. Imagine a woman in 1050, perhaps tidying her hair or adjusting her simple clothing. She might possess a small, cherished, polished metal mirror. Upon realizing her monthly flow had begun, she would immediately set it aside, perhaps even turning its reflective surface to the wall. Fear would not be about a distorted image, but about the very act of interaction with her own mirrored self. One common belief was that her perceived uncleanliness could somehow tarnish the mirror itself, rendering it unlucky or harmful for future use by anyone else. This was a fear related to the idea of contamination, extending even to inanimate objects that absorbed aspects of a person's essence. Another, more unsettling belief was that looking at her reflection while menstruating could bring misfortune upon herself. The reflection might capture or amplify her unclean state, making her vulnerable to illness, bad luck, or even evil spirits. This ties into the broader medieval fear of the occult and the vulnerability of the body and soul during times of perceived weakness or impurity. Some folkloric accounts, though often difficult to date precisely to 1050, speak of the evil eye, or the possibility of an image reflecting back a distorted or cursed version of the self. The reflection was not a passive image, but an active participant in the spiritual landscape of a person. While direct written citations from 1050 specifically about mirrors and menstruation are hard to isolate, the widespread folklore surrounding mirrors throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, particularly their association with magic, fortune-telling, and vulnerability to curses, suggests a deep-seated apprehension. These beliefs were often passed down orally, deeply embedded in household traditions and regional superstitions. Careful handling of mirrors, the covering of them during death, and the various folk remedies involving reflections all point to a powerful cultural understanding of mirrors as more than mere tools for appearance. The psychological impact of this taboo would have been subtle but pervasive. It contributed to the overall sense of a woman's body being a source of mystery and potential danger, even to herself. It reinforced the idea that during menstruation, she was not quite herself, that her essence was temporarily altered in a way that could be harmful to her own reflection, and by extension, to her own well-being. Further emphasized the idea that the menstruating woman was a distinct entity, set apart even from her own mirrored image. This particular taboo, perhaps less overtly restrictive than others like access to churches or food, nevertheless added another layer to the complex tapestry of restrictions woven around women's lives in 1050. It spoke to a deep cultural understanding of the body, the soul, and the mystical power of reflections, creating a quiet but persistent barrier between a woman and her own image during a time when her body was already considered to be in a state of delicate and potentially dangerous flux. The very act of self-contemplation was made fraught with peril, making her feel like a stranger even to her own visible form. Number 4, the taboo of participating in specific crafts or activities. In the highly specialized and craft-oriented society of 1050, a deeply influential taboo dictated that women experiencing menstruation should avoid engaging in certain specific crafts and productive activities. This was not a blanket ban on all work, but rather a targeted prohibition driven by the belief that the perceived impurity or special essence of the menstruating woman could spoil delicate processes, curdle sensitive ingredients, or ruin the outcome of skilled labor. It was a tangible fear that her touch or even her presence could somehow disrupt the natural order and integrity of specific transformative acts. Consider the meticulous nature of medieval crafts. Take, for example, brewing ale. This was a common household activity, often undertaken by women and vital for sustenance. The process of fermentation is delicate, relying on specific conditions for yeast to convert sugars into alcohol. In 1050, without any understanding of microbiology, any deviation or spoilage was often attributed to unseen forces. Belief was widespread that a menstruating woman's touch could curdle the brew, preventing fermentation or turning the ale sour. Imagine the anxiety as a batch of precious grains in water, carefully measured, was left to ferment, with the fear that a woman's presence might irrevocably ruin it, leading to wasted resources and a lack of drink. Cheese making was another prime example. Transformation of milk into cheese requires precise temperature control and the action of rennet. Again, the process was vulnerable to spoilage. The belief was that a menstruating woman's touch could prevent the milk from setting properly or cause the cheese to develop a foul taste or texture. This was not just a domestic inconvenience. Cheese was a vital source of protein and a tradable commodity. Spoilage could have significant economic repercussions for a household. Dyeing textiles was another activity often subject to this taboo. Achieving vibrant and lasting colors from natural dyes was a complex chemical process. It was believed that a menstruating woman's touch could cause the dyes to not take properly, resulting in faded or uneven colors, or even altering the intended hue entirely. Given the value of dyed textiles, any disruption to this process would be a serious matter for those engaged in textile production, whether for personal use or for sale. These were not isolated beliefs. They were part of a broader worldview that saw the menstruating woman as possessing a unique, often volatile, internal state that could affect external processes, particularly those involving transformation or the manipulation of natural ingredients. The perceived potency of her monthly flow was so great that it was believed to exert an influence beyond her own body, capable of interfering with the subtle chemical and biological processes of the world around her. While explicit citations from 1050 detailing these specific taboos in craft manuals are rare, the pervasive nature of such beliefs can be inferred from widespread European folklore and later medieval and early modern texts that address these exact superstitions. For instance, agricultural treatises from the later Middle Ages often contain sections on avoiding taint in various processes, and traditional craft guilds sometimes had unspoken rules about purity and focus, which often included these types of gendered restrictions. Oral tradition and practical observations of artisans would have reinforced these beliefs over generations. The consequence for women was a further narrowing of their sphere of activity during their menstrual cycle. While they might still be involved in less sensitive tasks like spinning raw wool or mending clothes, they would be excluded from critical, income-generating, or life-sustaining crafts. This created a period of enforced idleness or relegation to lesser tasks, which could be frustrating and disempowering for women who were otherwise central to the household's productivity. It reinforced the idea that her body, while natural, was also a source of unpredictable and potentially harmful influence on the material world. The subtle fear of her presence disrupting the very chemistry of creation was a constant, unspoken burden, making her feel as if her very being was a variable that could lead to failure in the crucial processes of daily life. Number 3, the taboo of preparing medicine or engaging in healing. In 1050, healing was a blend of practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and deeply held beliefs about spiritual influence and the body's humors. For women, who often served as primary caregivers and healers within their households and communities, a significant taboo dictated that they should not prepare medicine or engage in direct healing practices while menstruating. This was not merely about avoiding the sick. It was a profound belief that her impurity could render remedies ineffective, turn them harmful, or even corrupt the very essence of the healing process. Imagine a situation where a child falls ill with a fever, or an elder suffers from a lingering ailment. In a medieval village, the first recourse was often the knowledge of local women, the village wise woman, the family matriarch, or even a nun in a convent. These women held a wealth of knowledge about herbs, poultices, and comforting remedies passed down through generations. However, if the woman herself was experiencing her monthly flow, she would be faced with a devastating dilemma. Her deep-seated knowledge and nurturing instinct would compel her to help, but the pervasive taboo would hold her back. The belief was that the perceived taint of menstruation was so potent that it could negate the healing properties of herbs, spoil the efficacy of a potion, or even transfer negative energy to the sick person. Medieval medical theory, based on the balance of humors, might have indirectly contributed to this. Menstruation was viewed as a purging of bad humors, then the woman herself might be seen as temporarily out of balance, and thus unable to restore balance in others. Furthermore, illness was often attributed to demonic influence or divine displeasure. A menstruating woman, seen as ritually impure, might be believed to exacerbate such spiritual afflictions rather than alleviate them. Consider the detailed and careful process of preparing medieval medicines. Herbs had to be gathered at specific times, dried precisely, and mixed in particular proportions, often with rituals or prayers accompanying their preparation. Belief was that the menstruating woman's touch or even her breath could interfere with these subtle properties, turning a beneficial concoction into a useless one, or worse, into a harmful brew. This put an immense psychological burden on women, forcing them to stand by while their loved ones suffered, unable to apply the very skills they possessed. While specific medical texts from 1050 detailing this precise taboo are not commonly unearthed as formal prohibitions. The underlying concept of ritual impurity and its detrimental effects on sacred or potent acts was widespread. Later medieval medical treatises and collections of folklore frequently warn against the tainted touch of menstruating women in various contexts, including healing. General distrust of female influence during menstruation in other sensitive processes, such as food preparation or craft making, extended naturally to the realm of medicine, which was considered a delicate balance of natural forces and divine favor. The social and emotional consequences for women were significant. Family members' condition worsened or failed to improve, and a menstruating woman had inadvertently, or out of desperation, attempted to provide care, she might be blamed. This pressure instilled a profound sense of self-restraint and a fear of consequences. The desire to nurture and heal, a fundamental aspect of many women's roles, was thus periodically suppressed by deeply ingrained superstitions and societal dictates. This taboo highlighted the paradoxical position of women in medieval society. Often relied upon for practical care and herbal wisdom, they were simultaneously viewed with suspicion and fear during their monthly cycle. Their bodies, the very source of life, were also seen as capable of disrupting the delicate balance of health and healing. The refusal to allow them to engage in preparing medicine during their period was a testament to the powerful, often irrational, fears that permeated medieval understandings of the body, illness, and the mysterious forces that governed life and death. The silent suffering of loved ones, compounded by the woman's inability to help, must have been a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the limits imposed by her natural bodily cycle. Number 2, the taboo of interacting with men and children in certain ways. Beyond the specific prohibition against sexual intercourse, a pervasive and deeply felt taboo in 1050 dictated that a menstruating woman should limit her interactions with men and children in broader, non-sexual ways. This wasn't necessarily a complete ostracism, but rather a subtle yet powerful expectation of distance and careful conduct, rooted in the widespread fear of her impurity being transmitted, or of her influence bringing bad luck or illness to those considered vulnerable. This created a nuanced but impactful social segregation, even within her own household. Imagine a bustling medieval household, perhaps a large peasant family or a noble retinue. Women were central to the daily flow of life, managing the domestic sphere, caring for the young, and interacting constantly with men in various roles: husbands, sons, servants, or even lords. When a woman began her monthly flow, a subtle shift would occur. The easy familiarity might give way to a more reserved demeanor. A wife might avoid sitting too close to her husband during meals, a mother might hesitate before embracing her child, and a female servant might be extra cautious about her proximity to male members of the household. The fear was multi-layered. For men, the primary concern was often the spiritual and physical taint that could be transferred. Medieval beliefs, sometimes influenced by ancient texts and folk traditions, held that contact with a menstruating woman could weaken a man, make him susceptible to illness, or even diminish his virility. While direct contact might not be explicitly forbidden in all daily scenarios, the underlying apprehension would lead to a natural distancing. A husband might instinctively avoid sharing the same spoon or cup, or a father might be wary of direct skin contact with his menstruating wife. Children, the concern was even more profound, as they were seen as particularly vulnerable and susceptible to negative influences. It was believed that the impurity of the menstruating mother or caregiver could make a child sickly, lead to developmental issues, or even cause misfortunes to befall them. This placed an immense emotional burden on mothers, who, despite their natural instincts to nurture and protect, were expected to maintain a careful distance. They might be discouraged from cradling an infant directly, or from sharing a bed with young children, especially if the children were already frail. These were not necessarily formalized rules written in stone, but rather deeply ingrained social customs and superstitions passed down through generations. They were reinforced by community whispers, cautionary tales, and the general cultural understanding of the menstruating body as a source of powerful, often negative, energy. While not every family or region observed these taboos with the same strictness, the underlying anxieties were pervasive across medieval Europe. Scholarly interpretations of medieval social structures and gender roles often touch upon the periods of ritual separation expected of women, even if specific menstrual restrictions are rarely detailed in administrative records. The emphasis on purity, especially in connection with religious life and social order, created a framework where any perceived deviation from a state of purity, such as menstruation, necessitated a form of social containment. Anthropological comparisons to other traditional societies, where similar beliefs have been documented, suggest the deep historical roots of these interpersonal taboos. The psychological impact on women was significant. Added another layer of isolation during a time that was already physically uncomfortable. She was not only dealing with her bodily process, but also the subtle cues from others that she was temporarily set apart. Constant awareness of needing to manage her interactions, to avoid perceived contamination, and to protect her family from her natural state must have been emotionally exhausting. It fostered a deep sense of responsibility, mixed with a silent apprehension about her own body's natural functions. This taboo created a delicate dance of proximity and distance within medieval households, where the natural rhythms of a woman's body subtly dictated the terms of her social interactions. It underscored the pervasive belief that the menstruating woman was a temporary carrier of a potent force, one that required careful management to prevent harm or misfortune from befalling the vulnerable members of her community, particularly men and young children. Her very presence, even in quietude, was seen as a force to be reckoned with, requiring a vigilant distance to preserve the perceived purity and well-being of others. Number 1, the taboo of public appearance and concealment. The most pervasive and all-encompassing taboo for women experiencing menstruation in 1050 was not just about specific actions, but about her very public appearance and the expectation of concealment. This overarching societal demand dictated that a menstruating woman should strive to be as invisible as possible, to withdraw from public life, and to meticulously conceal any signs of her monthly flow. This was rooted in a profound sense of shame, the fear of drawing malevolent attention, and the reinforcement of her unclean status in the eyes of the community. It painted her very existence during this time as something to be hidden, a secret burden. Imagine the daily life in a medieval village or town. Life was largely public, communal, and intertwined. People worked in fields together, gathered at markets, and attended church services. For a woman, her social standing and reputation were critical. To be seen as unclean, or to inadvertently reveal her menstrual state, was to invite scorn, suspicion, and potentially ostracization. Therefore, the greatest imperative was to remain hidden, to minimize any chance of detection. This extended beyond just physical concealment of blood, which was already a challenge given the rudimentary absorbance of the time, often consisting of moss, rags, or simply layers of undergarments changed and washed when possible. The concealment was also behavioral. A woman might avoid busy thoroughfares, remain indoors more than usual, or decline invitations to social gatherings. Her movements would become more guarded, her interactions more limited. The very act of existing in the public eye during her period became a source of intense anxiety. The fear of drawing attention was significant. In a world where superstitions about curses, evil eyes, and malevolent spirits were prevalent, a menstruating woman was sometimes perceived as being more vulnerable to such influences, or even, paradoxically, as capable of unintentionally transmitting. To be seen as a menstruating woman in public was to potentially invite unwanted scrutiny, or worse, to be associated with bad omens. This belief system created a powerful incentive for self-imposed isolation. Consider the psychological toll of this constant vigilance. A woman would not only contend with the physical discomfort of her period, but also the immense mental strain of ensuring absolute discretion. Every movement, every conversation, every glance from another person would be filtered through the lens of this overriding taboo. She might worry that her gait seemed different, that her complexion betrayed her, or that her general demeanor hinted at her hidden condition. This created a profound sense of shame surrounding a natural biological process, instilling the belief that her body, at this time, was something inherently embarrassing or dangerous. Historical evidence for this widespread concealment can be found in a variety of sources. Medieval medical texts sometimes advise women on managing their flows discreetly. Moral treatises occasionally warn against revealing indecent bodily functions. More compellingly, the pervasive nature of modesty and the cultural emphasis on female purity throughout the Middle Ages indirectly support the idea that menstruation, viewed as an impure discharge, would necessitate extreme concealment. The lack of open discussion about menstruation in historical records is itself a testament to the success of this taboo. It was simply not something spoken of openly, much less displayed. The implications for a woman's daily life were pervasive. Her routine was disrupted. Her social interactions were curtailed. Her public presence was minimized. She became, for a few days each month, a shadow within her own community, a person whose very being was to be kept from public view. This reinforced her identity as someone subject to bodily processes that were deemed shameful and polluting, a temporary outsider in the world she inhabited. The taboo of public appearance and concealment was thus the ultimate expression of the societal judgment placed upon menstruation, forcing women into a period of physical and social retreat, a silent acknowledgement of their perceived temporary burden.